Right, so Fix It Friday for 22nd of July. So today, before we get into the main topic, which is going to be about baking maps, image maps, there's a quick topic to just run through, and that's quite a few people are now transferring from 3D Studio Max, the older versions, and they're transferring over to Blender. And they're finding that they have issues when they import their FBX files. So if you are using the toolkit, not the toolkit, if you're using one of the legacy starter files, let's just female clothing. So if you're using one of these and you bring in an FBX file, so import FBX, so let's find let's just bring in these. So these are our settings. We'll leave the defaults. Those are okay. We don't need any animation, so disable that and double check that there's no arbitrary information. That's okay. Import FBX. So it'll bring in all the bits. What are the fingernails? I haven't actually brought in the fingernails. That's a little bit weird. Oh no, it was the earrings. So it'll bring in the component. That's what I was looking for. My brain got stuck for a second. It'll bring in the component, and it'll be, generally speaking, it will be correctly sized if you are using one of the legacy starter files. But if you, so let's refresh, general, don't save, sidebar, so this was an accessory, so attachment tool, that'll load in the attachment, and we just need to set this up before we can do it. So we have to select the head, that sets the avatar up, we want the female. So let's do the same thing again. File, import, FBX. Find the file again. We used earrings. Same settings as before. So that's okay, that's okay. Disable those two. That's all right. Import FBX. It'll bring in everything, but the scaling is absolutely huge, because the original Max file and the original legacy starter files are all scaled relative to the old avatars. The toolkit uses a completely new scaling, which means that for the sake of, if you are, depending on what you're importing, you might find, let's just hide all of these parts, because we have to assume, so you've imported your product to the avatar and you can't see it in the scene. Well, you can in this particular example, but just because we've got the scene set up, but you might not be able to see it in the scene because the scaling means that it's all the way up here. So what that means is that you'll have to rescale these items relative to the tiny teeny avatar down at the bottom there. But we need to do this in a particular way, because if we just scale it as we would normally do, so let's just enable the scaling tool, we get the scaling widget appearing at the object's origin. So this is our object that we're going to scale, a set of earrings. If we scale this, it scales it relative to the origin of the mesh. We don't want that. We want to scale this relative to the avatar down at the bottom here. And what we can do for that is use the 3D cursor, and we set that as a pivot point. So we change the pivot point to 3D cursor. And that will make, if the widget's active, any one of these active, it'll jump to the cursor. So what we can then do, zoom in on our avatar. Where are our earrings? That's the rig. That's kind of weird. Press the home key. They are selected, but for some reason they're not being shown in the, oh, there they are. Right, so that's our mesh. What we need to do is scale it relative to the avatar. Just reframe selected. Select our mesh. And what we can do is to rescale, click drag anywhere inside the white loop, click drag hold, and then type, because there's actually quite a lot of scaling to be done. We can do this more easily by typing a value. In this case, the FBX via max is about 100 times larger than the toolkit's avatar scaling. So what we can do is 0.01, and there is set of earrings correctly positioned and scaled relative to the avatar. So we just then press enter, and that completes the action. So that's all we need to do. It can be a little tricky if we try manually dragging. So let's undo that. It can be a little tricky to scale negatively by click dragging. Because the mesh doesn't always seem to behave the way that you expect it to. So an easier thing to do is just whilst we are, so the scaling tool is still active, there's the widget showing the, well, it's indicating that scaling is active. Whoops. What we can do is click drag to activate the tool and then type the value, so 0.01, and then hit enter. And that correctly scales any FBX files that are created in Max or Blender for that matter. Blender does the same thing, uses the same scaling. So that's the quick fix for importing FBX files. Ideally, what you'd actually want to be doing is File, Import FBX. So we're importing the FBX into a clean Blender file. Earring settings. So we use the same settings as before. Just get them imported. Because what we can do then is just delete the bits that we don't need. Because it may or may not bring in all of these parts. So delete everything. And then what we can do is scale that relative to the default scene using the same principle as before, using the 3D cursor. So again, pivot point, 3D cursor. So there's the widget. We want scale. Then click, drag to start the action or the operation, then 0.01. And there are our earrings. Enter to confirm. So let's just focus on those. Frame selected. Save the file. FBX import test. And then what we can do, now that we've got a clean file, toolkit, attachment tool, append attachment file. Again, set this up. So eyedropper head, female, and then what we can do is file, append. This is a bit more, there are a couple more steps to doing this, but the advantage of doing it this way is that you can clear out all the junk that you don't need from the FBX rather than it being inside the toolkit hierarchy, which can get quite messy if you're bringing in a lot of data. So file, append, we need to find the file, FBX import test, there it is, double click. We want the object folder, double click, earring mesh, all the settings are okay, we can leave those, and then just append, and there they are in place. Whoops. There we go. And then you can do what you need to do, setting this up as an accessory in this particular example. So that's two ways of getting FBX files created in other apps into the toolkit primarily. Right, so today's topic of focus is baking images. So what we'll do is just clear that out and load in Chellamore's settee, those beanbag things, because they're handy. What's that one? Okay, was that one? Where's the we've lost some parts. Oh, there it is. that one, which one is it? So it's that one. Open. So there we go. Right, so the basic bake process. Now we're essentially there are two ways we can bake textures for our objects. We're either going to be baking from a high-res mesh down to a low-res mesh, such that we are essentially using the high-res data to make the low-res appear much more detailed. And in the previous sessions, Fix It Fridays, we looked at baking normal maps and ambient occlusion. Some shading. There we go, so that's the ambient occlusion. So we can improve on this a little bit because it's got an edge that can be got rid of. So the basic process so we select our high, shift click the low, and then we're in render properties and we want the bake options, which are down at the bottom of the panel. And for this we're using ambient occlusion, or we're baking ambient occlusion. So from the bake type we set ambient occlusion from the list that's available. There's a couple. So ambient occlusion, and in this example we can bake the high-res data, so that's the pink, to what is currently the white. So we can bake the pink data, it won't be pink coloured, but the mesh structure from the pink object to the lower resolution mesh structure of the white object. So pink first, or high res first, shift click low res. Then in bake we want to set selected to active. It'll give us some options, and we can probably set max ray distance or extrusion. So let's just zero those out to give us a default, so a baseline. So that's all we need to do, is select it to active, and these by default will be set to 0. And then just bake. Click the bake button and it'll do its thing. And it'll look a bit dodgy because there's some clipping where the high res is showing through the low res, so we have to compensate for that. This is where these two settings come into play. And you can either use max ray distance, that changes the way that Blender calculates the data and renders it. It changes the way it does it I can't remember off the top of my head. It's relative to the system. It's relative to the distance that's being traced. Like if you were shining a torchlight at something. So let's just increase this to 0.2. Try bake. And that gives us a bit of a mess. So let's zero that. And let's try extrusion. 0.2. Let's try that. That gives us a slightly better result. 0.3. Bake. And that gives us an even better result. And of course, for something like this, for ambient occlusion, well, for all textures in fact, actually, ambient occlusion or diffuse, even shadow, which we'll get onto, what we can also do is bake the maps relative to how the object will be used in IMVU. So we can do something as simple as this. So we're assuming that this sits on the floor. So what we can do is bake ambient occlusion relative to the floor surface, but we don't want to be too close because it'll just render black, which isn't as useful for our texture making later on. So you bake, and what we do is we start to influence the ambient occlusion. Probably a little bit too close. But what this is doing is it's pseudo baking the object relative to what could be an environment. So let's say there's a wall situated to the back of this, like so. So this is situated near a wall. So high res, low res. Because again, what we're doing is baking the high resolution detail down to the low resolution, but for ambient occlusion in particular, we're also introducing objects into the scene that influence the way that this data from the high res is being baked to the low res. So it's compensating and including pseudo environmental conditions. Bake, and what we start to see is these pseudo environmental objects influencing our bake. So we can also, let's duplicate that again. So let's say this object is in a corner. Like so. So we've now got our object trapped in a corner. So high res, low res. So we're not baking any of these objects. These are not included in the bake except how they influence the results of the ambient occlusion in this particular example. So high res, low res, shift click, bake, and we can see that we're now starting to get a much more interesting bake. So if we now hide the high res, texture baking is a bit not the texture baking, the rendering is a bit iffy because shading beanbag, has it not refreshed it? That's why. Beanbag normal. Yeah, so what we need to do, we need to double check when we're baking that we've got the correct texture node selected. So what we want is the diffuse texture node, not the normal map texture node. So what that was doing, it was baking the ambient occlusion data to the normal map, which we don't want. What we wanted, or what we should have done, double check. So double check this when you are baking. Make sure that you have the appropriate, when you have your material set up, let's just expand this, so Control Z. When you have your material set up, so this is just a simple one. We've got our diffuse and we've got our normal, and that's connected to a normal node and then connected to normal at the bottom and then base color at the top for the diffuse. So if we were baking a normal map, we want this node selected. But if when we're baking a diffuse, we want this node selected. So make sure we have those nodes, the correct nodes selected when we're baking in order to get the data into the right place. So Control Shift. And then we can do that again. So beanbag, exit edit mode into object mode, unhide the high res, Shift, click, bake. There we go. So that should now be selectable or show on our object, and it does. So we can see the influence of our scene objects, our pseudo environmental lighting objects influencing our object. And we'd only really need to do this to the textures that we actually see, so the diffuse images. So if we were baking maps to create a texture from in our image editor, so let's just UV editor, we want to save this, so we've baked this image now and we want to save it. So there again, that's the influence of our pseudo environmental objects that approximates how this object is going to be used. So again, you could place pillows on the mesh, as well as having your walls and the floor. And those two would be baked into the ambient occlusion. And then once you've done that, in the image, well, the UV editor, it'll be in the UV editor, or you can also do it in the shading editor. We can select the appropriate image map using the Browse Image to be Linked button. Browse Image to be Linked, select. So there's the map that we've just baked. Hamburger image, and you'll note that there's a little asterisk appended to the end of image that indicates that there is some data to be saved. So we can save this image, save as, so file name, select your format. You want to use the lossless again, so BNP, bitmap, Targa Raw or TIFF. I tend to go with Targa Raw. Everything else is okay, and just save. So that then means that in our image editor, so find the image, so it's that one. We have a map that we can then do things with, so we can edit this however we see fit. So let's just drop in, whoops, and just color tint it. Like so. Save as. Export. Just do this as a JPEG so that we've got we don't override. That's all right. Export. That's okay. And then what we can do is load that. So we've got a white image at the moment, so we want to just click on. So we're replacing the diffuse. So click on the folder, click, get the file browser. What we need to do is now find the JPEG. There it is. Select open image, and there it is on our object. And of course you can do a lot more to it than that, but so what you ideally, that's what you want to be doing. If you're going to be including shading and shadows, try to avoid baking everything into your diffuse. So bake type diffuse, because with this you can include lighting, so contributions. So all you want is color. You don't really want to include indirect or direct lighting or illumination of the scene, but if you do include it, we don't have any lights in this scene, so let's just drop a couple of lights in. Light point. So just switch the render engine to proper preview, and this, we're in cycles because we're baking. Render engine set to cycles. Forgot to mention that before. And depending on the scale of your objects, the lights may not influence the scene. So what you'll have to do is select the light, go in Object Data Properties for the light or the lamp, and increase the value. It'll be quite significantly. Well, let's just try increments. So 10,000. Oh, that's okay. 10,000. So let's do that. So let's leave that as is. Go back into render properties. Right. Going to switch back to material preview just to save on resources. So we know there's a light in the scene, and we know that it is illuminating our object. So high, so we want our high res and our low res active, because again we're baking. Put our environment objects in place. We're baking the high res detail to the low res, but we're going to be doing the diffuse this time. So let's just double check that we have that is selected. That's okay. Low res. So we've got our bake type set to diffuse. We might get an error doing this, but we'll see what it does. So we're including lighting. So bake. So we can see what it's done. So it's included. Let's hide the high res. It's pulled in the color, the material diffuse color from the high res, dropped it onto our low res, but also included the light source. So you can do that, but ideally what you want to be doing, if you're baking diffuse maps, is just literally doing that. Just bake the diffuse. I mean, if you want to include the environmental aspects of the bake, it's best to include these in the ambient occlusion so that the diffuse is clean. All it includes is just color information. So high res, low res, disabled, those two, and then just bake. And that'll do that, literally. It'll just bake the diffuse color. But what this means, hang on a second. Yeah, so what it'll do is it'll just bake the diffuse color, and that's all you want from your diffuse bakes, just color. So once we've got that, we need to save this as well. Save as cloth diffuse, and again, format, lossless, location, name, save. Because what you want to really be doing is constructing your maps, your textures in your editors, so that you have a bit more flexibility over how everything works. So let's go with soft light, save, export, blah blah blah, export. Let's just call this beanbag. And then what we can do again, reload. So folder icon, reload in the beanbag. That's the new texture. Open. Let's get rid of the high res. And there is our texture influenced by the image that we've just collated together. So basically, try and avoid baking your map, your diffuse, all in one go, so that you don't want to be including lighting and all the other gubbings that you might be wanting to bake into a single image, because that's not as flexible. That's not as flexible for creating your, let's just, why is it, that's not as flexible as rendering or baking each of your maps separately and then assembling them in your image editor. It gives you much more flexibility doing it this way. So this is, that was a long-winded way of showing one way of influencing your objects indirectly without necessarily putting a light object in the scene, using ambient occlusion. And that's how flexible ambient occlusion actually is. It's incredibly flexible in terms of what it is that you can do. With that said, let's just save this actually. So save as 3. With that said, as we just saw, you can bake lighting, and you can create shadows as opposed to ambient shading, essentially. And for that, what we want to do is switch the bake type to shadow. And that'll change the settings. So whereas diffuse had direct and indirect influences, so contributions, these are lighting contributions. These two are essentially available by default when we have shadow set as the bake type. Obviously we need a light source in the scene. So that's our light source. So this time when we bake, so we're going to do the same thing again. Switch back to material preview for saving on resources. We'll get rid of the backgrounds because we don't really need those. So that's our light. High res. So high res, low res. Let's double check our material. So we are on the diffuse. So high res, low res. Again, bake type shadow. Selected to archive. Selected to active. We've got our extrusion set because max ray distance wasn't as effective as extrusion. You can use one or the other, or you can use both of them, but you generally don't need to. Let me just click bake. Oops. That's gone black. Why has that gone black? Oh, forgot to add it to the... Make sure it's set to render. So activate that. Try that again. There we go. So that's our shadow map. Again, it's set for our diffuse. So with shadow, when you're baking shadow, you have to be a bit more I was going to say creative, that's not quite the right word. But as you can see from the shadow map, it's quite literal in terms of how the light source influences the object. So depending on how you have the scene set up and the lighting set up, you'll get quite harsh contrasts on your bakes. So you can obviously influence the bake again by introducing our environment objects, and this should influence our bake. So that's all we've done. Added a couple of planes. Let's bake, see what that does. Nothing, because it's not influencing, it's not reflecting or bouncing the light around, unlike with ambient occlusion. So we have to set up the scene so that we use lighting. So let's just duplicate this, duplicate, reset. So we'll want to illuminate the scene or illuminate the object relative to how we expect it to be used or illuminated in IMVU. So let's drop this down to 2005. Duplicate. So what we're essentially doing is setting up a simple 3-point lighting system for our object. Oof, that's scaling up the hardware on the computer. So if we keep an eye on this, switch back to material preview, save on resources, enable our high res. So click, shift click. Let's go into material properties so we're not wrong one. Render properties, so we're not switching back and forth. So shadow, bake. So that gives us a slightly different result based on the lighting of the scene. So let's try that on its own. So disable that, just bake. And that is because we need to disable the render camera. So when we hide something, we have to keep remembering that if this is a render, if we're rendering something, we have to remember that when we hide something, we also have to hide it from the renderer. So we click the little camera icon and or the eye icon to exclude it from the render process. So we should now get a proper clean bake. So that's not quite as good as you might expect it to be. So you have to play around with your lighting to get the exact result that you're after. But it can be tricky. And in a word or in a sentence, this is why ambient occlusion is a bit more flexible than baking lights. But this is essentially how you are baking, or how you'll bake actual shadow maps or shadows to your objects or for your objects. Objects are in the scene. You place some light sources. They can be point lights, sun, spot, area. It doesn't really matter. I mean, area, the difference mainly is that point lights are literally just that. Light emanates from a point. So they tend to give much harsher shadows, whereas... So let's convert this into a where do we do that? Oh, there we are. Convert this object into an area so we can switch. But again, we have to watch out for the scaling. Position. Computer fan does not like messing around with lights. So if we bake this shadow map, we get a slightly different result. So the render isn't as clean as we might expect it to be. So what we can try and do is activate some denoising. Never really bothered with these settings personally because I have a preference for ambient occlusion because it's much more flexible and you don't spend as much time fiddling with the scene as we're doing right now. So let's try that, see if it cleans it up a little bit. Nope. But you might have different results depending on what graphics system you've got. Because this is using the CPU rather than the graphics card. So if you've got a system that's set up to use your your GFX card, you might get different results. But like I said, this is one of the reasons why I tend to prefer using ambient occlusion and setting up pseudo environments because you have much better control over the outcome of your maps. Have we dropped that into the wrong? No, that is the right. Yeah, that's a pretty nasty render. Let me just save this file and reopen it because there is a little bug I noticed the other day. So there's our pink original. Yeah, so we do actually have hard shadows. So this is where oof, computer doesn't like that at all. Probably hear the computer fan speeding up. So this is the one disadvantage with using lighting like this on low resolution objects, because the facets, so it's picking up on the facets of the low res mesh and it's lighting them or shading them in strict fashion, in the sense that it's being literal. With the shading. So let's try a high res, low res again, see what that does. See if we can break it. Yeah, that's not brilliant. So again, this is one of the reasons why ambient occlusion is better or more flexible than trying to bake your lighting directly into your object. I mean, the alternative is using the diffuse map and enabling direct and indirect lighting. Bake. That's not brilliant either. So it's just a question of trying each of the maps and seeing what sort of results you get. So those wall objects were influencing the bake. So we get different shading, different shadows, depending on how we have the scene set up. Whoops. So that is baking the basic maps that we generally use or can use for IMVU. And baking shadows directly isn't always optimal, isn't always the best way to go. Because you don't always get the kind of outcome that you want. So let's just... That's horrible, actually. So you'd have to do a bit more work. that versus ambient occlusion, which is much simpler to bake, and it does pretty much the same thing. Pseudo-directional lighting, when you have your object set up with a pseudo environment. So instead of adding lights, that's what you'll, as we just saw, instead of adding lights and illuminating the object, what we can do, which works better, is add objects to occlude light, so to block it, so that we create the shading. That also then means that we don't get blowout, so over bright areas where excuse me, where a light source is too powerful, it's set too high. But if you start fiddling with the values, you don't always get the kind of result that you want for this kind of setup that we're using for IMVU. So it's easier to just occlude light, place objects in the scene that are going to block lighting and shade our object, and we'll still get the same sort of result. Let that spin up. But this is the main issue you'll face with baking low-res objects when you are using light sources. They're very strict with the shading and the shadows that are rendered over low poly surfaces, so you'll often get these facets, and they can be tricky to get rid of just using light sources. So quicker, more efficient way of doing all of this is just to use ambient occlusion. But that is it's not the basics, but that's baking maps in a way that's going to be useful. Whoops, that's texture paint. Going to be useful for IMVU. Let's reload. And it pretty much does the same thing. Right, so we'll call it quits there. There's no other topics for this week. It was mainly just to just the baking. But hopefully that's been helpful. There's a lot to digest, because it's actually quite. It's not necessary that it's complicated as a subject. The bake process isn't necessarily complicated. Getting the best results is the bit that takes time and a lot of fiddling. And you may find that ambient occlusion is a better approach for what you're doing, especially if you are essentially trying to illuminate the scene using lights in a way that you are technically trying to create ambient shading as opposed to actual shadows. If you're going for shading, just use ambient occlusion. If you want shadows, then you've got a bit more of a challenge on your hand to get those to work within the texture space that we've got, you know, so 256, 512, and the fact that it's a low res mesh, which means that you're more likely to get faceting in your baked maps. So have a think about what you're doing, or what the outcome that you want before you actually start baking the maps, and try and keep all your maps separate. That's the key takeaway, really, is to keep all your maps separate so that you can combine them in your image editor as needed. So we shall see you, leave it there, and we shall see you next Friday's Fix It, which will be, will it be August? No, still a few more days till August, but we'll see you on the next Fix It Friday. So bye for now.